Hi, I'm Rosanne and welcome to my garden. Today's video is all about Irish moss or Sagina subulata. I've had a lot of questions and comments about growing Irish moss, so I thought I'd do a follow-on or advanced version to my Irish Moss Care and Propagation video. If you haven't seen it, I highly encourage you to do so. From my understanding, Irish moss is hardy from zones 4 through 10, can grow in acidic, neutral, and alkaline soil. I'd like to spend a moment talking about what Irish moss is and what Irish moss isn't. Irish moss is a common name for Sagina subulata. Common names can be confusing. They can vary region by region, and they can certainly vary country by country. Irish moss looks like moss. It grows low to the ground and is a nice lush green, but it's not at all related to what I'll call real moss. And real moss is what we see growing on forest floors and growing in moist, shady areas, maybe along, up the trunk of a tree or on the roof of a house or shed. Whereas Irish moss, or Sagina subulata, it's of the flowering plant division, and it's a member of the Caryophyllaceae family. And while that may be a mouthful and something you really don't care about, think of it, another name for Caryophyllaceae is the carnation or the pink family. So Irish moss and this flower are like cousins, versus Irish moss and real moss are only related in that they're members of the plant kingdom. That's where it ends. So when you are caring for Irish moss, think about carnations, because Irish moss does need sun, it needs moisture, it needs nutrients to grow, and then it will reward you and propagate. Our Irish moss propagates naturally very well by self-seeding. Look at these tiny little flowers, all eager to go to seed. The result of constant self-seeding is a thicker and thicker mat the older the plant gets. The seeds also spread to other hospitable areas of the garden and a new patch begins. The effect is casual, with little patches of green throughout the flower beds. Here's one little Sagina subulata plant. This is all it takes to get a patch going. In addition to self-seeding, the plant also naturally expands. If it has the right growing conditions, it isn't unusual for a 1-inch patch to grow 10 times its size in one season. Dividing or harvesting small patches from larger patches is another way that you can keep spreading Irish moss throughout your garden. The next topic I'd like to spend a few moments on is the ideal sun exposure for Irish moss and its moisture requirements. Isn't this a great little area? I love the flagstone, and for years I tried growing Irish moss here with no success. Finally, I gave up and let nature take its course, and growing between the flagstones, we actually have real moss. Real moss can be quite attractive, especially in deep shade where I haven't been able to grow Irish moss. In my experience, Irish moss does best with part sun and part shade. That said, I have Irish moss growing in areas that get full sun, almost full shade, and everything in between. A word of caution though for those of you in much warmer zones, I'd probably stay away from full sun exposure. It may be too much, even with adequate moisture. Irish moss prefers evenly moist soil, but not soggy or too wet. I try to water my Irish moss every other day. The roots are not very deep, so just a few minutes with the hose tends to do the trick. Despite my best intentions, areas of my Irish moss do dry out from time to time. As long as it's not too dry for too long, mine recovers just fine. We've talked about sun exposure, and we've talked about moisture requirements. There are a couple other things that Irish moss needs to really remain healthy, and one would be regular weeding. Moss Irish moss really does not compete well with other plants. It almost always loses. Therefore, it is imperative that you weed. One of the worst culprits that I deal with in my Irish moss is turf grass. Turf grass is very difficult to remove once it takes hold, so it's important to stay on top of it. Here I'm removing a section of grass from an area that should be filled with Irish moss. I use a knife to make sure I get up all the roots. Then, because I've left quite a hole, I make sure to fill it in with soil so that the Irish moss can easily reach out and expand. Backfilling holes in Irish moss with soil is important if you want it to expand and look nice and uniform. In addition to regular weeding, Irish moss also needs regular cleaning. And by regular cleaning, I mean removing all organic debris from the top of the moss. I find that my Irish moss tends to die out directly underneath things like leaves, petals, and tree seeds. So to keep the Irish moss healthy, I try to clean it weekly by either sweeping it with a broom or blowing it with a leaf blower. It always looks so great after a cleaning. There's no doubt that Irish moss in between flagstones is a great look. And a lot of people are interested in, one, how we grow the Irish moss between the flagstone. And I'll start by saying my husband has laid all of the flagstone, and he does so on top of very dry, sifted soil. Here's a bucket. This is about the consistency I'm talking about. It just kind of, it's almost like sand, and that's the effect we're going for, so that one, you can level the unevenness of the individual flagstones, and two, it provides a great growing medium for the Irish moss. So again, we don't use gravel, we don't compact gravel, we just use good garden soil as the base layer for the flagstone. And then he does the flagstone about an inch apart. Sometimes it's 2 inches, sometimes it's less. But we shoot for about an inch apart because that allows us to put in very small plugs in between the flagstone to get it growing. People often ask, how did I get started growing Irish moss and where can they buy some? My first experience with Irish moss was when I got about a dozen 1-inch plugs through the mail over 20 years ago. I've seen many garden centers begin to carry it around here. Seeds are also available on the internet. I haven't had much luck sowing seeds outdoors, so if you go the seed route, I might advise starting them indoors where you can control their environment more. People often wonder if Irish moss is invasive. Certainly not in Zone 4. Through seed dispersal, I happily find new little patches throughout the garden, but only where there's no competition. As I mentioned earlier, Irish moss doesn't compete well with other plants, so invasion isn't an issue here. It doesn't choke out weeds, rather they tend to choke out the Sagina subulata. Now, Sagina subulata and other species in the Sagina genus may be invasive in other zones and other parts of the world, so please be mindful if you decide to grow Sagina subulata. I've also been asked if I have any issues with pests or diseases with Irish moss. First of all, the healthier a plant, the more able it is to fend off pests. That is your best defense. That said, I did have an issue with a fungus, commonly known as brown patch, a few years ago. One of its telltales are tiny little spiderweb-looking threads, or mycelia, that you can see if you look very closely in the early morning when it's still wet. Although I prefer not to use pesticides, I did use a fungicide that time, and again the following year. Any fungicide labeled for use against brown patch should be effective, but be sure to follow instructions carefully and test it on a small patch first. Mine recovered just fine. I certainly hope you'll give Irish moss a try. It's such a lovely ground cover. I also hope you found this video useful. If you haven't already, please watch my other video, Irish Moss Care and Propagation. Thanks for watching.